All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're looking at this research article about Leigh syndrome in 2 puppies.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, it's a really interesting case.
It is.
It goes through the genetics, the neurology, and they even use fruit flies in this study.
Yeah, fruit flies are becoming quite a common model for, a lot of human diseases, even neurological ones.
Yeah.
So very interesting.
So for our listeners out there, could you give us a little overview of Leigh syndrome? What is it?
Sure. So Leigh syndrome is a pretty severe neurological disorder, and it mainly affects the central nervous system.
Okay.
And so what happens is you get progressive degeneration of certain areas in the brain, and that leads to a whole bunch of different neurological symptoms. And the problem really lies in the mitochondria, which are like the little powerhouses of the cells.
Yeah.
They're the energy factories. And so when the mitochondria aren't working properly, the cells don't have enough energy to function, and this causes a cascade of issues. And obviously, the brain being one of the most energy-demanding organs,
Of course.
it gets hit the hardest.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in this case, we have 2 puppies, right?
Yes.
From the same litter.
Exactly. 2 Jack Russell Terrier Chihuahua mixes.
Okay.
And around 4 months of age, they started showing signs of progressive decline.
Oh, wow.
Neurologically, yeah.
So young, too.
Yeah, really sad. Both puppies had ataxia, so difficulty with coordinated movement. They also had dystonia, which is characterized by involuntary muscle contractions.
Okay.
They had vision problems and changes in their behavior, so all pointing towards a pretty serious neurological condition.
And the fact that they're from the same litter, that kind of points to a genetic cause, right?
Exactly, yeah. Having similar symptoms in littermates really suggests that there's a shared genetic predisposition.
Yeah. So what were some of the tests that the researchers did to figure out what was going on with these puppies?
So they started with your basic blood work and cerebrospinal fluid analysis, really essential to rule out other causes, get an overall picture of their health.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, most of the results came back normal, except for one key finding: elevated lactate levels in both the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid. So that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
Right. For mitochondrial dysfunction.
Right.
You know, it means that the cells aren't producing energy efficiently, and the lactate builds up as a byproduct.
So that really got them thinking about a mitochondrial disorder.
Exactly. Yeah, put Leigh syndrome right at the top of the list.
Makes sense. So they did the blood work, the cerebrospinal fluid.
Then they did an MRI on both puppies to look at their brains.
Of course.
To see if there were any structural problems, you know?
Right.
And what they found was really interesting. They found these distinctive symmetrical lesions in specific areas of the brain, like the caudate nuclei, the cingulate gyri, and parts of the brainstem.
And those lesions are those like characteristic of Leigh syndrome?
Yes. And they showed up as these bright spots on the MRI images.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's a pretty classic finding for Leigh syndrome.
Okay. So they have all these findings. Did they do anything after the puppies unfortunately passed away?
Yeah, so they did a histopathological examination.
What is that?
So that's basically looking at the tissue under the microscope to really confirm what they saw on the MRI, but to also look for any other clues. And the examination did confirm those lesions, those brain lesions that they had seen on MRI.
Okay.
And really importantly, they found abnormalities in the muscle tissue as well.
Ah, interesting. And the muscle abnormalities go along with that mitochondrial dysfunction, right?
Precisely.
Because they need a lot of energy.
Exactly. Muscles are very energy demanding, just like the brain.
Gotcha.
So any kind of disruption to the mitochondria, you're going to see it in the muscle tissue too.
That makes sense. So we've got these elevated lactate levels. We've got these characteristic brain lesions. And we've got the muscle abnormalities.
Right.
So they're like, okay, this is Leigh syndrome.
Pretty much, yeah. It's all fitting together. But they didn't stop there.
Okay.
They wanted to find the exact genetic cause.
Of course, yeah. They want to figure out, like, what's the gene, what's the mutation?
Exactly. They used whole genome sequencing.
And just to remind everyone, what is that?
So that's basically analyzing the entire DNA sequence. It's a really powerful tool. You can identify genetic variants associated with all kinds of diseases.
Wow.
It's really revolutionized things.
So they're looking at the entire DNA, like, code to find something that's off.
Yes, and they did.
They found something.
They found a mutation in the NDUFS7 gene.
NDUFS7, what is that?
So NDUFS7 is really important. It's part of complex in the mitochondria.
Right, the energy factories.
Exactly. And complex I is key for energy production. It's the first enzyme in what's called the electron transport chain.
All right.
It transfers electrons from NADH to ubiquinone to generate this proton gradient that's needed for ATP synthesis.
So if there's a problem with NDUFS7, that's going to mess up the whole energy production process.
Yeah, you got it.
Right.
Right.
And then the brain's not going to work.
And everything else, yeah.
Right, but especially the brain.
Especially the brain, because it needs so much energy.
Okay, so they've got this NDUFS7, right?
Yeah.
What does this mutation actually do?
So it's a missense mutation.
Okay.
Which means it changes a single amino acid in the protein.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it changes a valine to a methionine.
And so what does that do? Changing that one tiny thing?
Well, it might seem like a small change, but it can have a big impact on the protein's structure and how it functions.
Okay.
Because that mutation's in a very highly conserved region of NDUFS7, which tells us that it probably plays a really crucial role in how it functions.
Wow.
And the computer analysis suggests that this substitution is probably damaging, potentially affecting its stability or how it interacts with other components of complex.
Wow, so it's really amazing how like such a small change at that level can have such huge consequences.
It really is. It really highlights how intricate and delicate these biological systems are.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One little change can just topple everything.
They find this mutation, right? Do they just assume that that's the cause of Leigh syndrome in these puppies?
Well, they didn't just assume that. They did further research to support it.
Okay.
And they used, get this, fruit flies.
Fruit flies? Really?
I know, right?
How do fruit flies play into this?
Well, fruit flies are actually incredibly valuable for studying human diseases, including neurological ones, believe it or not. They are powerful model organisms. They have a ton of genetic tools that allow scientists to manipulate genes and observe the effect on development and behavior. And surprisingly, there are a lot of genetic similarities between flies and mammals.
Really?
Yeah, especially when it comes to these really basic biological processes.
Okay.
Like energy production. So it's kind of a roundabout way to learn about ourselves.
So they basically gave fruit flies the same mutation as the puppies.
Exactly. They engineered these flies to express that mutant version of the canine NDUFS7 gene, and then they watched what happened as they developed.
Wow.
It was fascinating. They had developmental problem and neurological abnormalities that mimic some features of Leigh syndrome.
Wow. That's crazy, right?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
That you could, they're so different, but you can kind of recapitulate what's happening in these dogs.
Exactly. That cross-species validation really gives strong evidence that mutation in NDUFS7 is responsible for the Leigh syndrome in the puppies.
It's like a little model, right?
Exactly.
Of what's happening.
It's a beautiful example of how studying a disease in one organism can help us understand the mechanisms.
Right.
And maybe even lead to treatments for other species, including humans.
Yeah, that's incredible. So we learn about dogs, but we're also learning about us, potentially, right?
Actually.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing.
So they find this NDUFS7 mutation. What does that mean for, breeders, for people who have these types of dogs?
So that's huge for breeders, right?
Yeah.
Now that they know what gene and what mutation causes Leigh syndrome, they can screen for couriers and make much more informed breeding decisions.
That could really change things for these breeds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It could really reduce the incidence of Leigh syndrome.
Right. You can kind of prevent it.
Exactly. It's like having a superpower. Yeah. Being able to predict and prevent this terrible disease.
Yeah, it's incredible. So they found this, they figured this out, but what about the puppies?
So unfortunately, there's no cure for Leigh syndrome. Right.
The treatments are mostly supportive.
Okay.
Focusing on managing those symptoms and improving quality of life.
So making them as comfortable as possible.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to reverse the damage.
Unfortunately not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At this point.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that is really sad.
It is a sad case.
Yeah.
But I think there's hope for the future.
Yeah.
Because now that we know about this NDUFS7 mutation, it opens up possibilities for gene therapy.
Oh, wow.
Or maybe even developing drugs that could enhance complex eye function.
Oh, okay. So it's like giving us a target.
Exactly.
Something to aim for.
It gives us something to work with.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
It is.
So obviously we still need to learn a lot more about Leigh syndrome.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the big questions that researchers are still trying to figure out?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is, are there other mutations in NDUFS7?
Okay.
Or even other genes involved with complex FAB?
That could cause Leigh syndrome in cases where we haven't been able to find a genetic cause.
So there might be more to find.
Exactly. We found one piece of the puzzle, but are there more pieces out there?
And was there anything about this specific study that might limit our understanding?
Yeah, the researchers themselves mentioned that they only had 2 puppies from the same litter. So it's a very small sample size.
Right.
The findings are definitely compelling, but we need more research with the larger group of dogs that are more diverse.
To see if it holds.
To really determine how common that mutation is, if it's a factor in other breeds.
Yeah, so more research is needed.
Always.
But it's a great starting point.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
It lays the groundwork.
Yeah. What else could they have done to make the study even stronger?
Well, they weren't able to perform enzymatic activity assays.
Okay.
Those would have allowed them to actually measure complex eye function and confirm that the mutation was affecting its activity.
Right, like directly measure it.
Directly measure it.
Okay.
But they had limitations with their samples that prevented them from doing that.
So we don't have that final proof.
Yeah, we're missing that final piece of evidence.
Yeah, we can guess.
Right.
But we don't know for sure.
Right, exactly. We can infer it based on everything else, but it would have been nice to have that direct measurement.
Yeah, makes sense.
But even with those limitations, the study provides some really compelling evidence for the role of NDUFS7 in canine Leigh syndrome. And it opens the door for future research.
To figure out new treatments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
New therapies.
That's pretty amazing, you know.
Yeah.
We start with a vet noticing some problems in 2 puppies.
Right.
And it turns into this huge investigation with genetic testing in fruit flies.
Yeah.
And then we're learning things that could help humans.
It's amazing.
It really is.
It highlights how interconnected life is on this planet.
For sure.
We can learn so much from each other.
Absolutely.
Even from our pets, you know? It just shows the power of scientific curiosity and that willingness to explore the unknown.
It's really cool.
It is.
So this deep dive, it's taken us through a lot. Leigh syndrome, whole genome sequencing, fruit fly research. This is incredible.
It is pretty amazing.
It really is.
What we can learn when we're willing to ask those questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just keep digging.
Keep digging.
Yeah, so cool.
It is.
Well, thank you for taking us on this journey with you.
My pleasure.
And yeah, this is really cool.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about this in the future.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to come, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, this is really just the beginning.
Absolutely.
And with each pregnancy, there's a 25% chance that a puppy will inherit 2 copies of the mutated gene and develop Leigh syndrome.
Oh, wow.
A 50% chance they'll be a parier like the parents, and a 25% chance that they'll inherit 2 normal copies and be totally fine.
So that's why genetic testing is so important for breeders.
Absolutely.
So they know, you know, if the parents are carriers.
Exactly.
And then they can prevent, you know, puppies from being born with this awful condition.
Yep. It can make a huge difference.
Yeah. So it's not curable.
Right.
But maybe someday it will be.
We can hope.
Yeah. But for now, it's about managing the symptoms, making the dog as comfortable as possible.
Exactly. But even though this is a sad case, I think it does offer some hope for the future. Now that we know about this mutation, it could lead to new treatments.
Like what?
Well, maybe gene therapy.
Wow.
Or even drugs that could help complex eye work better.
So this research is like giving us a target.
Exactly.
Something to work towards.
The starting point.
That's pretty amazing.
It is.
So obviously there's still a lot more to learn.
Oh, tons.
About Leigh syndrome.
Yeah.
What are some of the questions that researchers are still trying to answer?
Well, one big one is, are there other mutations in NDUFS7?
Okay.
Or other genes that are involved in how complexa OR works that could also be causing Leigh syndrome?
Interesting.
Especially in cases where we haven't found a genetic cause yet.
So maybe this NDUFS7 mutation is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
And there might be other pieces out there.
Exactly.
Were there any limitations with this study that might affect our understanding?
Well, one limitation that the researchers mentioned was the small sample size.
Right. Only 2 puppies.
Exactly. And they were from the same litter.
Right.
So, you know, their findings are interesting, but we need more research.
Okay.
With more dogs, different breeds.
To see if this mutation is common in other dogs.
Exactly.
So basically we need more data.
Always.
Yeah. Is there anything else they could have done?
Let me think.
To make the study even better?
They mentioned that they weren't able to do enzymatic activity assays.
And what are those?
So those tests actually measure how well complex eye functioning.
Oh, okay.
So they could have directly confirmed that the mutation was messing with its activity.
So that would have been like the final proof.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have that direct measurement.
But they couldn't do it.
They had some limitations with their samples that prevented them from doing those assays.
So we can kind of infer what's happening, but we don't have that final piece of evidence.
Unfortunately not.
Okay.
But, even with those limitations, this study gives us a lot of good evidence that NDUFS7 is involved in canine Leigh syndrome.
So it's a good foundation.
Definitely. It opens the door for more research.
Which will hopefully lead to new treatments.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
It is pretty amazing.
It all started with a vet noticing something was wrong with these two puppies.
Right.
And it turned into this whole investigation with genetic testing and even fruit flies.
It's incredible how much we can learn from studying animals.
Yeah, it really highlights how connected we all are.
Exactly. It reminds us that we're all part of this big web of life.
Yeah.
And what we learn from one species can often help us understand others.
Including ourselves.
Exactly.
That's really powerful.
It is.
So we've learned a lot about Leigh syndrome. We've talked about whole genome sequencing.
Yeah.
And even the role of fruit flies in research.
It's been a wild ride.
It has.
Right. Yeah. And it's a great example of how studying rare diseases, even in animals, can lead to these broader insights, to these complex biological processes, and maybe even open the door to potential therapies for similar conditions in other species.
Like humans.
Exactly.
It's amazing. It's like a reminder that we're all connected in this big web of life. And discoveries in one species. Can really have these ripple effects across the entire, scientific world.
It's true.
So this deep dive, it's been incredible, right?
It has been.
We went from these two sick puppies to uncovering this complex genetic mystery.
It all started with a simple observation.
Yeah.
A veterinarian noticing that something wasn't right. And it just spiraled from there into this in-depth investigation.
And now we have all this knowledge about this NDUFS7 gene and complex and how it all works.
It's amazing what we can learn when we're willing to ask questions and dig a little deeper.
Yeah. And this research could even have implications for human health.
Exactly. It's a great example of the power of comparative medicine.
Yeah, using what we learned from animals to help humans.
It's a two-way street, really.
That's really cool.
It is.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive.
It has.
I've learned so much about Leigh syndrome, genetics, and even fruit flies.
Who knew fruit flies could be so helpful?
Oh, no, right?
There's little powerhouses of research.
They are.
So much to learn from them.
Absolutely.
From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.